Today's episode is brought to you by DeSanto Propane. DeSanto Propane is 4 generations strong as a trustworthy family-owned business with unmatched customer service. Go online at DeSantoPropane.com for more info or call toll-free at 1-800-752-4574. Since 1937, the difference has been DeSanto Propane. How do you get your news? Today we are discussing the health of media and news in the business locally and beyond, and we are lucky enough to be joined by the incomparable Steve Keeler, who just a few months ago retired from his gig leading the telecom department at Cayuga Community College. Steve, how's partial retirement treating you?
Josh, I have to tell you, I highly recommend retirement now to everyone. I didn't think I would, but it's, I think, the best decision I ever made. I will tell everybody the faster you can get there, the better.
36 years-ish?
36 years at Cayuga. 36 very productive years, 36 very fulfilling years. But, you know, you get to a certain point in your career and you know that it's time to turn it over to somebody else. And so that's what I did. But I have stayed on part-time. So, you know, I'm doing some special projects for the college. I'm still teaching my drone classes, teaching people how to do cinematography with drones. And then the college took over the production of the high school football game of the week regionally. So I directed a crew of students and professionals doing 10 weeks of high school football coverage, live game every Friday night, televised regionally. And that was a lot of fun. I enjoyed doing that.
Yeah. 30 plus years, realistically, probably closer to 40 years being a consumer and being embedded in the news business. When you look at that, when you look at those years, what are a couple of things that stand out to you as sort of big changes that happened? And when were those windows? When were those years where a lot of change seemed to happen in a short amount of time? Because in some ways, I think that, you know, when I look back at the last 12 or so years that I've been in the business here, I think, you know, at times it feels like we'll go 3, 4, 5 years and it feels like nothing changes. And then, you know, 1 year we'll have a 6-month window where it feels like everything's changed and the industry is completely different. When you look back at your career in the last 40 years, like what stands out to you?
Well, you know, my career goes back now 53, 54 years because I actually started in the business when I was 16, when I walked into a newsroom off the street and just said, "Are you looking for anybody?" And it was a small weekly newspaper, and the editor looked up from her desk and she said, "Well, yes, we are. Can you write?" And I didn't even think about it. I just said, "Yeah, I can write." And so she sat me down at a desk in the office and she said, "Well, here, our ad salesman just went out and got an ad from an auto shop, and there's a female mechanic." Right. This was 1971. No one had ever heard of a female mechanic at that time. She said, "Write a story about her. If it's any good, I'll hire you." So I sat, that was my audition. I sat there and wrote a story. It wasn't bad, I guess, because she hired me. But that was 54 years ago. And certainly the media landscape then was very, very different. It was still at that time dominated by print newspapers, mostly big city dailies, but in every town of any size, even towns that didn't have size, there was a weekly newspaper. So, you know, everybody read newspapers. Everybody had one or more papers delivered to their house. I can remember when I was a teenager, my father had 5 newspapers delivered to the house. He had the Syracuse Post-Standard delivered in the morning, the Herald Journal delivered in the afternoon, and on Sundays he had the New York Times, and he went out and bought the New York Times and the New York Daily News to read, and then he had the local weekly paper delivered. So he took 5 papers every week, and that was not uncommon that people would, read multiple newspapers. I think that landscape pretty much stayed the same because really 10 years after I walked into that newsroom, 10 years later, I got hired by the same newspaper, now owned by a different publisher, to become the editor of their little chain of weekly newspapers. And still then, everybody was reading newspapers. I think the big change, I think we can look back 30 years to the early 90s when the internet first comes into consumer use as the time that we really see the big change. And there were two things that happened, right? The internet allowed us to communicate with each other, and then digitization, being able to digitize print, audio, music, and video, then allowed us to transmit those things over the internet. And I think that was where we marked the big change. And I think if we look back 30 years, if we were sitting together here in 1993 and we were talking, like Katie Couric on that famous clip from the Today Show, what's the internet?
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
What's internet? Could any of us have predicted in 1993 that the internet and digitization would have disrupted the music business and the recording industry through file sharing, would have disrupted the print business through social media and search engines, and would have disrupted the film and television industry through streaming? I think those, that's probably the biggest change right there. Now, what does that change lead to? Well, it leads to, I think, what we're talking about today, which is the severe diminishment of local news, which I think is a real problem here, locally, and around the country.
Yeah. When you look at, this is a question that I get from time to time from people, of course, who don't work in the business. They'll say, well, when somebody says, what's the health of the news business? It's like they're asking me to give it this assessment, like this letter assessment. If you were going to try and give it just the industry as a whole, the news business, a letter assessment, like a grade, how would you grade it? Because when I think about it, it's like newspapers have declined so slowly in the big picture. We're talking about a decline that started in the mid 90s, and accelerated through the mid 2000s, but has happened slowly enough that I think it's missed a lot of people. It's not on a lot of people's radar necessarily until they're just all gone. So it doesn't necessarily feel as bad, I think, for some people. But, I look at the news business now and I see what hits with people and what doesn't hit with people. And the cynic in me feels like it's a barely passing grade. But do you feel any differently about that? Do you feel a little more optimism about where it sits right now, or is it as bad as some of us in the industry feel like it is?
Well, I mean, sitting here with you in this situation, I feel optimistic because I think what you do here at Finger Lakes One is a model that could be adopted around the country. Because you and your colleagues and your staff have really come in and filled a vacuum in local news, and you've done it really, really well, and you've done it by innovating. And I think you guys here have a lot to be proud of with that. And I think people who live in Seneca County and in Seneca Falls and the surrounding region that you cover should consider themselves very, very fortunate that Finger Lakes One exists. Because without you guys here, this would be what we call a news desert, a place where there is no local news, where the residents, the citizens would have no idea what's going on in local government, how their tax dollars are being spent, how public resources are being used. If it weren't for you and the work that you and your staff do here, folks here wouldn't have any idea of what's going on unless they were an office holder or somehow maybe a county worker where they had some, insight because of what they do. Otherwise, they wouldn't know. So when I sit here, I feel very optimistic, right? But when I, look around at the landscape around the country and around New York State in particular, and, in this region outside of what you do, the grade I give it is a C. And I give it a C because I think every news organization is really trying.
Yeah.
But they're not being innovative enough, and they're not being innovative enough fast enough. They seem to be unable to catch up with the rapidly changing landscape, and they seem unable to come up with models that are going to work and make the sort of legacy, what we would call a legacy media, right? The print organizations, radio, television, to make them competitive in the the landscape of search engines and social media, things like TikTok and Facebook and Meta and Google. They're constantly running 10 steps behind those folks.
Yeah, it's interesting when you frame it the way you did. I think about us. I think about Finger Lakes One, and oftentimes over the last 10 years of my life here, I've wondered if we hadn't come up and essentially been born alongside the internet, because Finger Lakes One was founded in 1998. Would we be as successful as we are now? We've essentially grown with the internet. And I think one of the challenges for a lot of newspapers was that they ignored the internet for too long, right? Which I guess isn't really a secret, but it makes me wonder about the effectiveness of taking the model that we do here and planting it elsewhere or in other places where they already are news deserts. Because I think once you lose it all, there's an element of it's very hard to get back. It's very hard to kind of like put everything back in the bag and try to repackage that up. It's tough. And I think of some of the initiatives. Patch Labs has tried to basically create a platform where individual content creators can go out and with as little friction as imaginable, go out and try to create a news product for a small community. But at the end of the day, it takes a very unique individual to spearhead that. And it's tough because one of the things, just from my observation, and I think you'd be great to lend some insight here, one of the things that I think has really fallen behind over the last 10 or so years, partly because of how fast technology has moved, is education, how we actually educate and train and develop journalists of the future or of the present day. When you look at the evolution you had to go through in your space, in your department, did it feel like you were just barely able to keep up given how fast technology was changing, or did it feel like you guys were adequately staying ahead? Because I think of some of the institutional big J type education powerhouses in the country, and I look at what they're turning out, and they might land a really great job at ABC or one of these big powerhouses, but by and large, they're built, and those journalists are built to tell stories to people who don't really hear them the way they did when newspapers were as strong as they were in the 80s and 90s. So when you think about education, how much of that has had to evolve and needs to evolve more given what journalism looks like in 2024? Well,
when I look at what you do here, I always find it very interesting because, my observation is, you take a story, whatever it might be, and you repurpose it so well. Right. So what I see is, okay, you do a show like this, and we have a video version. There's an audio version. You sometimes do a print transcript. You notify people all kinds of ways through social media and through emails, even. You're using every single facet of communication that you can to get that story out to people, and that's where I think some journalism schools fall short. Now, journalism schools are very good at training journalists to do interviews, to write stories, to do the research, to do the fact checking. But what they're not so good at is, what some schools call convergent media, teaching journalists to write across multiple platforms all the time. And teaching journalists, you can't, it's not just you going and talking to somebody. You've got to be able to interview them live on TV. You've got to be able to, convert this into an audio program. So I think that's a bit where they fall short. But I've seen some programs that approach it pretty well. I was looking at St. John Fisher the other day and what they do in their journalism program, and they're pretty effective at teaching students, very different ways of approaching how they do their stories.
When you think about language, and that your answer just now triggered this thought, when you think about how language has changed just in common communication, and how that translates to the news business, is there an element? Because one of the pieces of feedback that I've always kept front and center throughout my career is the average person reads to an 8th grade level. And, depending on what publication you're reading, you may need to read it at college level in order to really understand what's being communicated. And in my observation, that feels like one of the big things that's been missed in training journalists, is that ability not just to communicate across different platforms, but sometimes to be able to bring it down and sort of simplify and communicate more straightforward, in a more straightforward way, the things that are happening.
Mm-hmm.
Does that track, like in terms of 40 years, language has changed, communication has changed a lot.
Yeah, it's sort of the lowest common denominator theory they used to have in television, right? Every TV show had to appeal to the average 12-year-old so that it could appeal to everyone. I think if we look back historically at print journalism in particular, what we see is different publications appealing to different groups of people, right? The idea that, the tabloid newspaper was lots of pictures, fewer words, had a mass appeal, right? And then the broadsheet newspaper, like a New York Times, was considered to be more intellectual, more challenging stories, more analysis, and appealed to a different audience. And so I think in the days gone by, that idea that, we want to approach different people in different ways was handled by different publications, right? Now how do we do that? Well, the answer is, I think with fewer outlets, we probably don't do it very well. And maybe that's one of the reasons why people turn to social media to get their news, because in many cases, they're getting what they believe to be news and information from their peers, people just like them. And that satisfies that need. And that's one of the challenges I think legacy and traditional media have, is that so many people, because it's so easy, they turn to social media and they turn to search engines to get what they consider to be news, rather than turning to established media outlets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Kind of looking at industry by industry, or media type by media type. I think of the things that I'm seeing happen in television news, the things that I'm seeing happen in newspapers. Obviously, we've talked a lot about newspapers, but radio also, all kind of going through these different evolutions at different speeds. When you look at the TV news product, we'll shift and kind of look at that for a second. What do you see that stands out to you now that's going either really well or really poorly?
Well, I think with TV news, one of the things I think that's going really well is the expansion of local news on television stations. When I think about, let's just say 30 years ago, when the internet was first starting, if I looked at a local news station, I would see a local news show at 6 p.m. and 11 p.m. Mm-hmm. So a half-hour show at each one of those time slots. So 1 hour of local news per day. In order to meet some of the challenges posed by the increase in the availability of the number of channels, first through cable and now through internet, to meet the increased interest in streaming and the loss of audience, one thing local television stations have figured out is that local content will keep them alive. Local content will draw in advertisers. And so they've expanded their local content. So now, when I look at a local television station, I see, well, now the local news starts at 4:30 in the morning and it goes on until 7 o'clock. And then there are inserts for a few more hours at the top of the hour for a couple of minutes and the bottom of the hour for a couple of minutes. Then more local news comes on at noon for a half an hour or an hour. And then the evening news, instead of starting at 6, oftentimes starts at 4 or 4:30 and runs until 6:30. And then there's another program at 11, with some stations even adding a program at 10. So, we've seen that local television stations are surviving and in many cases thriving because they've expanded local news content, which is a good indicator that that's something people want. Because if people didn't want it, they wouldn't put it on the air. We put on the air things that people want. And how do we know they want it? Because advertisers buy it.
Yeah.
I think it's important to remember that all of these things, all of the news that with a few exceptions, but pretty much all of the news that we get, whether it's on television, on newspaper, on the internet, it's all advertiser supported.
Mm-hmm.
All right. That's what pays for it. And advertisers pay for that because people are watching, listening, or reading. Even when we think about, the internet and social media and search engines, we think, well, that's free. Well, it's not free. There are tons of ads now, right? Billions upon billions of dollars of advertising. I think the last thing I read was that social media platforms and search engines generate $200 billion of ad revenue in the United States every year. That's a huge amount. It's a huge sum. But they've drawn that away from things like print newspapers, local television, local radio.
Yeah, I mean, all of that has pretty much come at the expense of local media. It's interesting you mentioned that because I think back to one of the last conversations you and I had at your office at the college before the pandemic, and you said eventually local TV stations are going to just be 24-hour news stations. And it's interesting because we've kind of quietly approached that, where you still have your primetime programming, you still have your daytime talk shows. But when you look at local TV networks, they're doing a lot more news. Do you think that's something that they can keep growing? Or do you think they reach a point where, they can't really cut into any more than they've already cut into?
Well, I think it depends on, I think they can keep growing. That's the answer. Yes. I think that there is a place for multiple hours of local news, more than we have now. But it's so dependent on their, if they're network affiliates, if they're affiliated with a big television network, it's so dependent on their contracts with the networks is how much where they can expand into.
Yeah. It's interesting because we've seen a lot of streaming options, especially on the weekend when you have sports. Obviously, a lot of the TV stations will do their broadcast streaming on Facebook or on YouTube or whatever the case may be.
Well, you have to meet the audience where it is.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
Yeah.
And I think if you look at, local television stations, they're really multimedia platforms now. They have that, they have the television signal that they put out. But, they all have robust websites. They all have robust social media sites. They have people working at the stations who are their social media specialists and social media managers, who repurpose their stories onto different platforms. So, they're trying. Again, it's the same thing. They're trying, but they're not catching up fast enough.
As you've seen students come and go, what's the interest level in television style news compared to, I don't know, maybe like 15 years ago?
Yeah, it's not as great now.
Does it just look different though? Because sometimes I think an 18-year-old today might not think of it as TV news, but the thing they want to do is TV news. It's just like it has a different name, but it is in action the same thing, right? Is there an element of that at play?
I think so. I mean, I always tell students, I don't care what you're watching it on, it's all television. If you're watching YouTube on your phone, or if you're watching something on a big screen, or if you're watching, a quick video on your wristwatch, I said, I don't care. It's all television.
Yeah.
Well, what I found, is that over, the last 30, 35 years, I have fewer students coming in who are interested in journalism. 30, 35 years ago, I had a substantial number of students would say to me, I want to be on TV as a news anchor or a news reporter. They were very, there was a lot of interest in that.
Yeah.
That has diminished, at least at Cayuga over time. And, what I see now is more students coming in and saying, I want to work in the film business. I want to be a film director. I want to be a camera person. I want to make movies. They're far less interested in the news business and far less aware of the news business. And I think it's because, for someone who's right now 18, 19, 20, and has had a, smartphone since they were 8 or 9 years old, they have, most of them don't watch what we would call regular television at all.
Yeah.
Their television viewing is social media television. They watch short videos on YouTube. They get their news off some kind of a feed on their favorite social media platform, or they get it on TikTok in a 20 or 30 second video from who knows who.
Yeah.
So their concept of news is very different than what it was 30 years ago when, everybody got their news. Everybody was familiar with television news. I will often ask students, do you know who David Muir is? Because he's a local guy who made it big as the anchor of ABC News, which is the top rated national news program in the United States. So he's a big deal. I would say more than half will say, I don't know who you're talking about. And that is, I think, very different than what we might have seen 20 or 30 years ago.
It's interesting because it almost, just as a layman kind of thinking about that scenario that you described where students are more interested in going into film or going into, the entertainment industry as opposed to the news business. I sit here and think to myself, boy, if there was one industry I was going to pick that might be harder to make it than the news business is, I guess I'd pick film because it just seems like but maybe that's just my preconceived notion of it. It does make me wonder though, about the pipeline of future, because, you've got this scenario where TV stations, local TV stations are trying to grow. They're trying to do more, but the pipeline is probably less than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago.
I would say that's true. I think, we've seen around the country enrollment in journalism departments decline, except for the very biggest and most famous ones. But I would say, if a school isn't a Columbia School of Journalism or, the Newhouse School or the Cronkite School out in Arizona, if it's not one of those big sort of renowned schools with a large alumni base and, well known for what its graduates do, they're struggling.
Yeah.
And I think it's because, one, students, like we talked about, lack a certain amount of awareness of the news industry and what it is, or, they've heard that sort of trope that's been out there for many years. Journalism is in decline. There are no jobs. Don't go into journalism. And there's a big push in the last 10 years that if you're going to go to college, you better go into a program that's going to lead to lucrative employment or it's not worth it. And, there are certain fields that are now seen as, may not be worth it. Yeah. And I think journalism gets lumped into that. because of the perceived decline of jobs in journalism that we've seen as newspapers in particular have declined.
Yeah. I mean, I can go back 15 years when I was in high school, and, I can recall having those same conversations with my guidance counselor. You don't want to go to school for journalism. I was already writing for the local newspaper. I was a freshman in high school, the first time I was, published by the local newspaper. And, it was one of those things where it was what I wanted to do from the jump, but I was told you absolutely should not do that. It will be a bad decision. Instead, I went to school for something that I hated and that didn't work out. But still wound up in the same place. Now I have to say, there also one of the things that I'd call it friction for the industry, at least in the early part of my career, was, well, you can freelance for us, but you can't work for us full time because you don't have a journalism degree. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's like, my byline looks the same. Yeah. Either way. And now, one of those local entities, I'm not going to name names, but one of those local entities is no longer in the same condition that it was back then when that executive vice president had that conversation with me and said that. But it's the point, I think, that to be good at this, you don't have to go do a certain educational path. You don't have to have a certain life path. But it does make it harder for, I think, new, fresh energy to get injected into an industry. And I'll be honest, one of the things that I was really eager to talk to you about is the rise of TikTok journalism. And I don't know how much of it you've seen, but I've had 2 different conversations now with folks in traditional media, on other programs, about how the most innovative journalism that I, as a consumer, am seeing happen is on TikTok, and it's vertical video, and it's under 3 minutes long. And for some people, that is a very bad thing. Some people look at that as a very bad thing. Mostly, I think, because of the length of time. You really have 1 to 3 minutes to keep people's attention, and then it's gone. But also it really flies in the face of what a lot of the standard bearers of the industry have required of journalists over the last 30 years. But when I look at what those people are doing, I see so much of what reporters and journalists were doing in the 70s, in the 80s. They're just in there doing the dirty work, man. It's just they're not, it's not pretty, it's gritty. It's usually not produced that well, but they're just conveying the information. And it's when you look at that, or when you hear about that, isn't that what these bigger players should be capitalizing on?
Sure. Absolutely. I mean, you go back to, we look at any type of television news, there's no story that's more than 30 seconds or a minute. Right? Yeah. So, but that works for people. And people do like to get their news in small bites and small doses. And if you can communicate to someone the gist of an idea in 30 seconds or a minute or 2 minutes, that's effective journalism. And, it has been for a long time.
Yeah. It's funny because a lot of, I think the Washington Post, I've noticed it on, I think the New York Times does it. A lot of the bigger publications put the time to read stamp at the top of the story. And it's funny because the difference between these short form videos, sub 3 minutes, and these longer stories, or visually, they look like they're imposing long stories, they're all roughly the same amount of time. It's just a matter of whether you have to go through and read it, or whether you're just listening to somebody or watching somebody talk about something. It's so interesting to me because, you just mentioned the television example, none of the stories that you're seeing on the 5 o'clock news or the morning news are longer than 30, 45, or maybe a minute 15.
Right.
It's all the same. It's all the same stuff.
It is pretty much the same. It is. I think, with TikTok journalists and TikTok journalism, to me, there's 2 things going on there. One, some of those journalists are presenting us with stories that are not only great news, not that it's, that it's great, but good, solid news stories, but they're entertaining, right? And we all tend to put a premium on entertainment. And if something is a bit entertaining, it's much more watchable than if it's, dry, right? I think about watching, some of the news outlets like an MSNBC or a Fox or some of these Sunday morning shows like Meet the Press, where it's a panel of people sitting around talking to each other, right? Those have very limited audiences. There's not that many people who are willing to sit through that kind of stuff, even though it's incredibly informative. And even though it's incredibly useful information, they have very limited audiences for that type of presentation, where a TikTok video that might be 30 seconds or a minute that might present the same information, but in a more entertaining way, will attract a bigger audience, and the information will be more memorable to the people who watch it. Now, the other thing that's going on, I think, and this I think goes back to really to the 70s and 80s, the sort of vibe of some of that TikTok journalism reminds me of the vibe of the underground newspaper scene of the 70s and 80s, right? Every city in the country in the late 60s through the 70s and 80s had a so-called underground newspaper to rival the traditional daily paper, because the daily papers throughout the country tended to have the same format, the same style, covered the same stories, and were institutions. And as institutions, we're very friendly with the other institutions in that region, whether the institution were the law enforcement, the courts, the local politicians, the local churches, and we're often not terribly critical of other institutions. And so as a reaction to that, the underground newspaper scene started, in which those reporters were much more aggressive, tried to look under the carpet in ways that, the local dailies would never do. They were much more innovative, and they revealed a lot of issues to people that they didn't know existed. And a lot of that TikTok journalism reminds me of that too. People going into and delving into areas that the traditional media either don't think are important or don't have the resources to cover. And that, that's important. Now, whether the folks who are doing that on TikTok are doing it well or not is a different story. I think you're unique in the fact that you're a great journalist, but you didn't go through journalistic training at a journalism school. We call it J school, right? And I always think that people who go through that training, what's great about them is that they tend to be, when they do their stories, they tend to be reliable because they're doing their fact checking and they're doing their research, same as you do. And so that to me is more reliable in terms of news than someone who I don't know who they are, and I don't know what their agenda is, and I don't know who they're working for. And even though the story might be entertaining, I'm always a little iffy about, well, what should I believe here or not believe? And that's not to diminish what folks do, but it's just there are so many people out there presenting information on the internet who, is it real information? Is it just rumors that they're spreading? Is it stuff they made up? So there's that whole aspect of what we call citizen journalism as well. What's the citizen journalist's agenda?
Yeah, it's interesting because you mentioned the underground newspaper element, and a lot of the TikTok journalists that have come onto my personal radar on those platforms are people who appear to have, I can't confirm that all of them have, but appear to have come up in that way, where they're specified in a hyper-local area or a city usually, and they start by just kind of like covering their local geography. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because it does feel like we're having, in form of content creator, we're seeing a bunch of like ragtag news organizations in form of individual creators like crop up all over the country. And they're just on a new platform. The crazy thing to me is that the traditional media is almost just like the same way that newspapers did with the internet. Traditional media as a whole is just putting them on the other side of a brick wall and just pretending those people don't exist, or they're bad because they're on a platform that, some politicians say they don't like, or what have you there. That's kind of the surprising thing to me. But when I look forward, like in some ways, I think that's where a vast majority of people will get their information sooner than later, because the platform is not going anywhere. TikTok is not going anywhere. Radio. When you look at what radio is today, I think that's the one, if we're looking at any of these, while things seem dire for newspapers, I think for the average consumer, radio feels like it's in a bit more of a dire situation. When you look at what radio has done over the last 30 years, you mentioned obviously how streaming and how file sharing kind of changed the music side of that. But when you look at news on the radio, have we reached a point of kind of like, there's no turning back at this point, that it can't come back, the platform's too far gone? Or do you think there's some hope there for news on the radio to exist in some format moving forward?
Well, I mean, at this point, news on the radio is pretty much a dead issue. I mean, there really isn't much news on the radio anymore. Radio has become, in the last 30 or 40 years, a music format. The vast majority of stations play a particular genre of music that's aimed at a particular segment of the listening population, that helps them differentiate themselves from the other stations so that they can attract advertisers who want to advertise to that particular segment. I don't think there's really much in coming back for news in radio. I think it doesn't pay for them to do news. Because they have to maintain news staffs if they're going to do local news. So I think the best we get for news on the radio now is the occasional at the top of the hour. We get some national headlines and weather. The only exception to that is in non-commercial radio, NPR. And they do a nice job. They do a great job with national news. I mean, they're really great. But I don't think we're going to see local news revived on the radio at this point. I just don't think there's any, I don't think radio stations, well, first of all, most radio stations are owned by larger chains, and there's almost no local presence in the local station. So I don't think we're going to see local news come back on radio. I think that, to me, that's a dead issue at this point.
What do you make of we still see some of the stats get thrown around by the national organizations? 93% of all people listen to the radio. What do you make of those kinds? Is that smoke and mirrors, or do you think there's still?
No, I don't think it is. I think as long as there are cars that have radios, radio will thrive, because people will listen to the radio in their cars. I mean, if you're, now I understand, many people will, because of, Bluetooth transmission, and Bluetooth capability in cars. I understand that, obviously that many people just turn on their phone and listen to their own music while they're driving around. But there's still a very substantial portion of the population that when they're in their car and they're driving to work or home from work or whatever, the so-called morning drive time and the afternoon drive time, they will tune into the radio, particularly if there is a personality on the radio that they like, or if there's a particular kind of music on the radio that they like listening to that's presented by a personality that they like, right? The morning show host, the afternoon show host, whether it's a local host or a national host, people will listen to the radio as long as long as radio's in the car. Yeah. So I think when we see those statistics that are put out about listenership and about advertising revenue, those things are true. Advertising revenue for radio stations hasn't really declined all that much in the last 10 or 20 years. It's stayed pretty stable. What's changed about radio is that most stations now are owned by a large chain of stations, and often in many cases, the DJs that we hear aren't even at the local station. They're someplace else, and they, are broadcasting, could be hundreds of miles away from the local area, but doing a so-called local show in the morning.
Yeah.
That's what I see with radio. I just don't see news coming back with radio. There's too many other outlets, and it's just not lucrative enough.
Yeah. Two things I want to get to before we wrap up here. AI, first and foremost, still very new, not something that I think is too highly leveraged in local news. I think some of the bigger chains that we've talked about, I saw a story a couple of weeks ago about Gannett, kind of being in a little hot water because they were maybe trying to pass off AI generated news as real human news. And maybe some of the people who worked along those AI reporters didn't even know that their counterparts were AI. Mm-hmm. When you think about the good and the bad that AI can potentially have on the news business, more good, more bad, somewhere in the middle?
Probably somewhere in the middle. I think it's all still up in the air now. I mean, one thing I think AI can do that's helpful, if you or I are researching a story, the right AI software can make that research much faster and much more robust. We can get a lot more done in a lot shorter period of time if we have the right kind of AI search engine helping us with our research, and we can get a story done much, much quicker, much more quickly. And that could be a big help. I think, what's the flip side? Well, the flip side is, it's certainly going to be a lot cheaper for media organizations to have AI software write stories rather than people write stories. And as AI develops, it's going to be harder and harder to differentiate between whether it's a person, like a live human being who wrote a story, or an AI, news writing engine that wrote that story. So, I think there's a path that certainly we could be going down, in which AI starts to replace journalists. And I think all of us would hate to see that happen. And that's the big fear about AI, right? Job displacement. AI is going to replace people in jobs. I mean, this is why the writers in Hollywood were on strike. This is why the actors in Hollywood were on strike. They're kind of on the forefront of that, because AI can write great scripts. They can write great movie scripts. Maybe not great, but passable movie scripts. Yeah. And, you can take a few samples of an actor's voice and suddenly have that voice, be the voice of a cartoon character for a movie or for an entire series without ever having to hire the actor back. Yeah. AI scans of actors' faces and bodies, as AI develops, can be used to recreate them digitally in a way that we wouldn't even know it's not them. Yeah. So there are a lot of, so actors and writers in some ways are on the forefront of AI, replacing jobs.
I want to say, I could be wrong, I got to fact check this after we get done recording. I want to say the Beatles' quote unquote last song that was just released a few weeks ago, one of the verses was entirely generated with AI, as in sung through using samples of one of the Beatles' voices.
Yeah, my understanding was that the first thing they did was they used a piece of software that Peter Jackson, the director of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, mm-hmm. that he developed for some of his documentaries, where the artificial intelligence could pull out John Lennon's vocal from a track in which he was playing piano and singing at the same time into a microphone, so that prior to this, they couldn't separate the piano from the voice because they were both on the same track. They weren't on separate tracks.
Gotcha.
So this AI software that Peter Jackson's people developed is very good at pulling out a portion of audio where there are several audio things
layers
going on.
Yeah.
So like, maybe several people speaking, you can pull out one person's voice. John Lennon singing over a piano, you can pull out his voice. So that was the one thing they did. They pulled his voice out and got it finally separate from the piano he was playing. And then I think they used AI to enhance his voice. And I'm not, and you have to fact check this. I know there was some AI enhancement on his voice. I don't know if they actually created new voice tracks from his voice.
I mean, either way, incredible stuff, given how new AI is to the entire, so it's not hard to imagine that scenario where you're describing, an entire movie or an entire television series is generated from AI.
Oh, well,
it's incredible.
There was a Doonesbury cartoon a couple of weeks ago in which the one character, Bitsy, whatever her name is, she's a Hollywood actress. She's on the picket line, and people were complaining about, well, they're going to use AI to take my job away. And she goes, well, I had myself scanned years ago.
Everybody's thinking about it. Let's talk a little bit about the election. 2024, it's going to be a big year.
Yeah.
Could be a rematch of 2020. Yeah. May not be. Yeah. Probably will be. Probably. A lot of focus, I am sure, on news and how it's covered.
Yeah.
When you think about this next election cycle, this will be the third election cycle with, I'd say, more heavy attention on how the media presents it and covers it. What are you watching? What indicators are you watching for that are either going to show you that perhaps some of the news organizations that gave the entire industry a bad name in 2016 and 2020 have learned something, or perhaps not learned anything?
I don't know that they've learned anything, to be honest.
Yeah.
I don't see that anybody's covering things any differently. Other than that, what did I read the other day? What is it that some of the news organizations won't broadcast about Trump because if he's on trial for, in different things.
I know there's a debate happening right now about whether his trial should be televised.
Yes.
And I don't know if that's necessarily the same.
Yeah, no, there was some issue about what could they broadcast about him and not broadcast about him because of some of the trials going on. So that's a little bit different.
Yeah.
Because one of the things in 2016 that brought Trump to the forefront was every time he would have a rally, MSNBC and Fox and CNN would show these rallies, almost in their entirety, all the time.
Yeah.
And it encouraged a lot of people to vote for Trump because they saw lots and lots of people at these rallies. Whether there was a lot of people there or not, I don't know. But on camera, it looked like a lot of people.
Yeah.
So I know they've stopped doing that. They're not as inclined to spend as much time on showing candidates speaking to large groups, other than, oh, here's the candidate. He was speaking to a large group. Oh, now let's move on to something else.
Yeah.
So I think that's different. And I think the other thing, is we are certainly all more aware of efforts by foreign players, like the Russians and the Chinese, to influence elections through the use of social media and through the use of fake sites and misinformation. So we're all far more aware of that than we were in the last two election cycles. I think news media are far more aware of that and are less likely to jump on the bandwagon on things on social media because they're now, certainly trying to verify things in a way that they didn't before when they're on social media. So I think those things are very different than in the last two cycles. Other than that, I think in general, the news media fall into the same trap that they've fallen into before, which is it gets them more viewership to be partisan and to talk about the partisanship and to talk about the divide than not talking about, or by saying, "Oh, the divide. We're not as divided as we think we are." It's much more lucrative to play on that, and you get more viewers when you play on that. And that's I think a real problem in politics and in elections, because it then tends to divide the electorate.
Is that your biggest concern looking to next year, to that cycle? Is the potential damage that could do if we do see just kind of more of the same, and that, push to divide through coverage?
Yeah, I think it keeps people apart. And I think in general, regardless of which side anyone sees themselves on, we're not that different from each other, right? I mean, everybody's concerned that taxes are too high. Everybody wants their kids to go to a good school. Everybody wants to have a decent job that pays well enough that we can live at least decently in a decent home. Pretty much most people want the same thing, but it has been certainly expedient for the news organizations, and to a certain extent the candidates, to make us believe that we're on two completely polar opposite sides. And how the media gets away from that, I don't have an answer to that. I don't know what the answer is to that. And I don't know that there's ever been a good answer to that. Historically, media have been very partisan. I think, we were fortunate that we lived in an era up until maybe 10 years ago where the media were not seen as very partisan. They were just seen to be middle of the road and objective. But most people, I don't think, perceive media that way anymore. They perceive any stories as partisan and having an agenda. I don't know if it's necessarily true, but I think in many cases it is. And I think it's especially true when a media organization sees that it can be more lucrative for them to be partisan than be objective.
Happens less on the local side.
Yes.
Is what I often tell people. When you're watching MSNBC or you're watching CNN or Fox News, they are essentially selling a product that's packaged and catered for a certain person, a certain consumer.
Right.
And that's driven by what their advertisers want or are buying. They're buying those eyes. So, it doesn't necessarily translate to local news, which I always say is the reassuring thing about what we do. Steve, thanks for coming in today. We certainly appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, thank you for asking me, Josh. I really appreciate it. It's been great talking to you. And I wish you, continued success with what you're doing here at Finger Lakes One. I think it's absolutely great. It is such an essential service to this community. I think people should be very, very appreciative of what you and your staff and colleagues do here.